The great training hall of the Kirith Academy was silent when the human entered. Hundreds of alien eyes turned toward him, tall, shining beings with skin like polished stone, eyes like liquid metal, and armor that shimmered in the bright light. They were the finest warriors of 50 worlds, trained to become the protectors of the Galactic Union. And in the middle of all that grace and power stood one small, awkward human. His name was Daniel Reeves. He looked completely out of place. His body was shorter, his skin pale and fragile-looking compared to the blue and silver tones around him. His uniform hung loose on his shoulders and his boots seemed one size too big. While others carried plasma blades that hummed softly with energy, Daniel held his like it was too heavy for him. Even his heartbeat, quick and nervous, felt out of rhythm with the calm confidence of the aliens around him. SThe noticed all of it. She stood near the front row, tall, proud and beautiful in the way only a Kirith warrior could be. Her eyes glowed faintly violet and her voice carried an edge that could cut steel. She had been born and bred for combat. Every motion of hers was balanced, perfect. When she saw Daniel, a laugh escaped before she could stop it. "Is this your new cadet?" she said loudly, turning to the instructor. "This little thing?" A ripple of laughter moved through the room. A few of the other alien cadets chuckled too, whispering in their own languages. Daniel heard them, of course, but he didn't respond. He just stood there quietly, his eyes meeting SThe's for a moment before dropping again. That calmness irritated her. Most creatures looked away when mocked by a Kirith, but this human, this fragile thing, only smiled softly, as if her words didn't matter. "Human," SThe said, walking closer until she stood before him. "Do you even know what this place is?" "This is the Kirith Academy. The greatest warriors in the galaxy are trained here. We fight wars that end worlds. What could you possibly learn here?" Daniel's voice was low, almost gentle. "Maybe I can learn a lot," he said. SThe tilted her head. "And what can we learn from you?" He paused, thinking. "Maybe something you've forgotten," he said quietly. The room fell silent for a moment. Even the instructor looked curious. But then SThe laughed again, shaking her head. "Forgotten? Human, your species barely joined the Union 50 years ago. You have no telepathic networks, no genetic enhancements, no plasma cores. You still bleed red like a child." Daniel didn't argue. He only nodded once, still smiling, that same calm, unreadable smile. It wasn't arrogance, it was something else. Something she couldn't name. The instructor cleared his throat, cutting through the tension. "Enough. Every being deserves a chance here. Even humans." SThe returned to her place, though she kept glancing back at him. There was something strange about Daniel. He didn't seem angry or even embarrassed. He looked thoughtful, almost peaceful. That bothered her more than if he had shouted back. The rest of the day went by in training exercises. SThe watched as Daniel struggled with even the simplest movements. The gravity of the Kirith world was heavier than Earth's, and his body wasn't used to it. He fell often, stumbled more, and his energy readings were the lowest in the class. Every time she looked at him, she saw weakness. And yet every time he fell, he stood up again, no complaints. No excuses, just quiet focus. By the end of the session, his uniform was torn, his face streaked with sweat and his arms trembling from exhaustion. Still, he didn't stop. He practiced until the lights dimmed and the hall emptied. SThe stayed behind, watching from the shadows, unable to explain the odd feeling in her chest. She had seen thousands of warriors in her life, strong, fearless, powerful, but none of them trained like that when no one was watching. None of them looked so fragile, and yet so determined. When Daniel finally dropped his weapon and sat on the floor staring at his bruised hands, SThe found herself wondering for the first time, why didn't he quit? What drove a being so weak to keep standing? As she turned to leave, she heard him whisper something softly to himself. The translator in her ear caught the words, "Well, they'll laugh today. That's fine, but one day they'll understand." SThe froze for a moment. The words echoed in her mind long after she left the hall. That night she told herself she didn't care. He was just another weak student who would wash out by morning. But deep down, under her pride and her laughter, something had changed. For the first time in her life, SThe felt curious about a human, and though she didn't know it yet, that small spark of curiosity would soon grow into something far greater. Respect, friendship, and a truth that would shake her to her core. The next morning, the training yard buzzed with noise. The Kirith sun burned bright above the glass dome, and hundreds of cadets stood in perfect lines, their weapons glowing faintly. Among them was Daniel, the only human in the entire academy. He looked smaller today. The bruises from yesterday's training were darker, and his uniform hung damp with sweat. Zyra stood across the field, arms crossed, watching him with quiet disbelief. He had come back. She had expected him to quit after the first day. Humans, she thought, were soft, too emotional, too fragile. But there he was again, standing straight in line like he belonged. The instructor, Captain Tereth, walked across the yard, his silver armor gleaming. His voice echoed like thunder. Today we test your synchronization with the battle net. If you cannot link with it, you cannot fight with your squad. Every Kyreth warrior was born with a neural spark, a small natural connection to the battle network that allowed them to sense each other's moves. Most alien races had similar gifts, but humans, they had none. Zyra looked at Daniel and sighed. He's going to fail. The test began. Each cadet stepped forward, pressed their palm to the glowing crystal at the center of the field, and closed their eyes. The crystal lit up, changing colors based on the strength of the connection. Some shone bright violet, some deep blue, some golden. When Zyra's turn came, the crystal flared bright purple, strong, confident. She turned and saw Daniel waiting behind her, quiet as always. When his turn came, he stepped forward, placed his hand on the crystal, and closed his eyes. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then faintly, a flicker, a weak spark of light, then darkness again. The others whispered, "That's it?" Pathetic. Did he even connect? Daniel removed his hand slowly. His face gave nothing away, but Zyra could see the slight tightening in his jaw. Captain Tereth frowned. "Human, your connection is non-existent." Daniel nodded once. "Understood, sir." The instructor's tone softened slightly. "You may continue physical training, but without a proper link, you'll never join a combat unit." Zyra expected Daniel to look defeated, to hang his head or walk away. But he didn't. He just nodded again and went straight to the training field. He began practicing alone, and the same basic strikes over and over again. The same movements everyone had mastered weeks ago. But he repeated them endlessly, until sweat soaked through his clothes and his arms trembled with exhaustion. Zyra watched, trying to understand him. "Why?" she finally asked, walking over. "Why are you still trying? You can't even use the network. You'll never pass the Academy's combat tests." Daniel paused, breathing hard. "Maybe," he said. "But I can still get better." "Better?" Zyra frowned. "Even if you train for years, you'll still be weaker than the rest of us." Daniel smiled faintly. "Maybe strength isn't only what you can measure." Zyra tilted her head. "What do you mean?" He leaned on his practice staff and looked at her. "You all fight together because your minds are linked. You can feel each other, but humans, we fight alone. We learn to think, adapt, survive, even when no one hears us." Zyra crossed her arms. "That sounds lonely." Daniel nodded. "It is, but sometimes being alone teaches you how to stand on your own." She didn't reply. Something about his words felt heavy, like they came from a place of pain she couldn't see. The sun dipped lower, painting the yard in orange light. Most cadets had left, but Daniel was still there, practicing with quiet determination. Each swing of his blade was slow, imperfect, yet full of will. Zyra stood by the door, watching until darkness fell. She didn't understand this human. He had no power, no gifts, and yet he refused to stop. When she finally turned to leave, she heard him mutter softly, barely a whisper. "Every failure is just another step. I'll climb as many as it takes." The words echoed in her ears long after she left. That night, Zyra lay in her quarters, unable to sleep. She tried to push the human out of her thoughts. But the image of him, bruised, sweating, still standing, and would not fade. She realized something she had never felt before, a small, strange respect. For the first time, she began to wonder if strength wasn't always about power, but about something deeper, something the human carried quietly like a hidden flame. And though she would never admit it, a part of her wanted to see what that flame could become. 2 months had passed since Daniel arrived at the Kyreth Academy. By now, every cadet knew him. The quiet human who trained longer than anyone else, who failed every test but never stopped trying. Some mocked him, some ignored him, and a few secretly admired his strange persistence. SThe found herself among that last group, though she would never admit it out loud. She had started watching him during training, from a distance, pretending not to care. But something about Daniel's calm, stubborn focus drew her in. He still couldn't link with the battle network. His energy readings were the lowest in the class, but somehow he kept improving in ways no one expected. He moved faster now, more balanced. He had learned to fight using instinct instead of telepathic coordination. He adapted to the Academy's heavier gravity and never once complained about pain. Still, most cadets thought he wouldn't survive the upcoming test, the Trial of Fire. It was the Academy's oldest and most feared challenge. Each cadet had to enter a holographic chamber that created illusions from their own deepest fears. The test wasn't just about strength, it was about will. The weak ones often broke under the pressure. Some even refused to go in. When the announcement came, whispers filled the training hall. The human will fail in seconds. He's not built for this. Maybe he'll finally quit. SThe didn't know what to think. She herself had trained for the trial since childhood, learning to control her mind and emotions. But Daniel? He had no telepathic defense, no neural stability. How could he face his fears alone? The day of the trial came. The cadets lined up outside the simulation hall. The air inside shimmered with heat. Walls of glowing red light surrounded the central chamber, humming with energy. One by one, the cadets entered, faced their illusions, and came out shaken but alive. When SThe's turn came, she stepped in confidently. The heat pressed against her skin, and the holographic flames roared around her. She saw visions, the faces of fallen comrades, her mother's disappointed gaze, the shame of failure. But she cut through them all. Her plasma blade sang, and the fire vanished. When she exited the chamber, applause greeted her. Her test time was among the fastest. But as she caught her breath, her eyes drifted toward Daniel, who was next in line. He looked calm, too calm. "Human," SThe said, walking past him. "You don't have to do this. The trial has broken stronger minds than yours." Daniel smiled faintly. "Then I guess I'll find out what mine is made of." Before she could reply, he stepped into the chamber. The doors closed behind him. Inside, the temperature spiked. Flames filled the air, swirling around Daniel like living creatures. The ground cracked beneath his feet, turning into molten stone. And then the illusions began. He saw Earth burning. He saw his home destroyed, his people screaming. He saw himself powerless to save anyone. The simulation dug into his memories, twisting his deepest fears into pain. SThe and the other cadets watched from the viewing platform. Daniel fell to one knee as the fire surrounded him. His skin glistened with sweat. The instructor moved closer to the control panel, ready to stop the test if it went too far. "End it," one of the cadets said. "He can't handle this," but SThe shook her head. "Wait." Inside, Daniel was trembling. His heart raced. His mind screamed for escape. But something inside him refused to give in. He remembered the nights back on Earth, freezing winters, endless work, moments when life itself had told him to stop. But humans didn't stop. They couldn't, it was not in their nature. So Daniel stood up, one step, then another. The flames grew higher, clawing at him, whispering that he was nothing, weak, useless, forgotten. But he kept walking. Outside the glass, SThe pressed her hand against the barrier, her heart pounding. He wasn't fighting with power or speed. He was fighting with something deeper, something raw and human. When the simulation finally ended, Daniel stood in the center of the ashes, chest heaving, eyes red but alive. Silence filled the hall. No one clapped. No one spoke. They just stared. Captain Tereth's voice broke the stillness. "Trial complete. Duration, full cycle. No early exit." SThe felt a strange pressure in her chest. She had seen warriors win with skill, with strength, with talent. But she had never seen someone win with willpower alone. As Daniel walked out, burned and exhausted, SThe met his eyes. This time, she didn't laugh. She bowed her head slightly, just enough for him to notice. And for the first time since his arrival, Daniel smiled, and not the calm smile of patience, but a real one. A tired, human smile of quiet victory. The night after the Trial of Fire was silent. The Kirith Academy, usually full of noise and training drills, seemed almost peaceful under the twin moons. The stars shone softly above the domed courtyard, and the wind carried the faint hum of the city far below. SThe couldn't sleep. She kept seeing the image of Daniel standing inside the flames, walking through fear itself without breaking. No alien she knew could have done that. Even the bravest Kyreth warriors had fallen to the trial's illusions before. But Daniel, he had no special powers, no battle link, no enhanced mind, and yet he endured. Why? The question burned inside her chest. Finally, she left her room and walked toward the outer wall of the academy. It was late and most cadets were asleep, but one figure sat there alone, the same human who now haunted her thoughts. Daniel sat with his back against the cold metal railing, staring at the horizon where the two suns would soon rise. His hands were still wrapped in bandages from the trial. His face looked tired but calm. SThe hesitated for a moment before walking closer. "You should be resting," she said. Daniel smiled faintly. "Can't sleep." She stopped beside him, folding her arms. "You survived something no one thought you could. You should be proud," he shrugged. "Pride doesn't help the burns." SThe almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. There was no arrogance in his tone, just quiet truth. She sat down beside him, unsure why. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the wind filled the silence. Finally, SThe asked, "Why didn't you give up?" Daniel looked at her, his eyes reflecting the faint starlight. "Because giving up never helped anyone where I come from." SThe frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He turned his gaze back to the horizon. "On Earth, we've always had to keep moving. My people started with nothing. We had no gifts, no wings, no telepathy. Just hands and hope. We lost everything so many times. To war, to hunger, to our own mistakes. But every time we fell, someone stood up again." SThe listened quietly. His voice was soft, almost sad, but there was strength in it. The kind that came from memories too heavy to forget. "So you fight because your people suffered?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "No, we fight because we remember. Every scar, every loss. It taught us something. My ancestors crossed oceans they didn't understand. They faced storms, plagues, and darkness. But they kept walking. That's what being human means." SThe felt something stir in her chest, something she didn't have words for. She had grown up believing strength came from perfection, from power, from training. But Daniel spoke of strength born from pain, from weakness itself. She looked down at her own hands. "I don't understand your kind," she admitted. "You break so easily. You bleed. Your lifespan is short, but somehow you never stop trying." Daniel smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why we have to try harder. When you don't live long, you make every day count." For a moment, neither spoke. The stars shifted above them, and the first pale light of dawn began to rise. SThe broke the silence again. "Do you miss your world?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Every day. But I also came here for a reason." "What reason?" He hesitated. "To see if the galaxy still needs what humans carry." SThe tilted her head. "And what is that?" He looked at her, eyes calm, voice quiet, but filled with something powerful. "Hope." The word hung in the air between them like a soft light. SThe didn't reply. For the first time, she felt small, not because she was weak, but because she was standing beside something she couldn't fully understand. A fragile creature from a forgotten world had walked through fire, spoken of pain like it was a teacher, and still found hope in the ashes. She looked at him one last time and whispered, "Maybe we all forgot what that means." Daniel smiled. "Then maybe that's why I'm here." The twin suns rose slowly, painting the sky gold and pink. Their light touched the human's bandaged hands and the alien's sharp features, blending them in soft warmth. Two beings, one born for war, the other born to endure, sat together in silence, watching a new day begin. And though neither of them said it out loud, something had changed forever in that quiet dawn. SThe no longer saw Daniel as weak. She saw him as something far rarer, a living reminder that even in a galaxy full of gods and warriors, there was still something unshakable about being human. The peace of the academy didn't last long. It began with a whisper through the communication network, a faint, broken signal from the outer defense grid. Then came the alarm. A deep, terrible sound rolled across the sky like thunder. The ground trembled as red lights flashed along the walls. Cadets ran through the corridors, their boots echoing in panic. SThe was in the training hall when the siren started. She turned toward the windows and froze. Above the academy, dark ships cut through the clouds, sharp black silhouettes against the pale morning sky. The Scorn Raiders, merciless warlords who destroyed colonies for resources for slaves or simply for fun. The Kirith Academy had never been attacked before. It wasn't meant for war. It was a place of learning. Most cadets were still in training, unprepared for real battle. Everyone to defense stations, Captain Tareth shouted, his voice shaking the air. Protect the command corps. Zyra grabbed her weapons and joined her squad. The ground shook as plasma blasts rained down, tearing through the domes. Explosions lit the sky in orange and red, and through the chaos she saw him, Daniel. He wasn't running away. He was helping others, pulling fallen cadets from the rubble, shouting orders even though no one had told him to. Zyra ran toward him. Human, what are you doing? You have no armor. He looked up at her, his face smeared with dust. Then I'll have to make do. Another explosion threw them both to the ground. The air burned. Zyra coughed, trying to regain focus. When she looked up, she saw Scorn soldiers pouring through the breach, tall, armored monsters with jagged weapons that hissed with plasma. Their black armor reflected the flames around them. Zyra raised her plasma blades, ready to fight, but there were too many. The Kirith battle net was down. No connection, no shared awareness. Every cadet fought blind. Fall back, she shouted, but her squad was scattered. She was alone. Then, out of the smoke, Daniel appeared again, carrying nothing but a broken metal pipe he had ripped from the wall. Zyra stared in disbelief. That's your weapon? He grinned, a wild spark in his eyes. It'll do the job. Before she could argue, the Scorn charged. Daniel moved first. He ducked under a plasma strike, swung the metal pipe into a soldier's leg, and grabbed the fallen weapon. His movements weren't elegant or trained, and they were rough, desperate, human. But every swing carried full intent, full emotion. He fought like someone who had spent his whole life surviving. Not winning, but refusing to die. Zyra joined him, blades flashing. Together they fought side by side, their movements clashing but somehow fitting. She was fast, sharp, and precise. He was raw, unpredictable, and fierce. When Daniel shouted directions, others followed without thinking. His voice cut through the fear like light through smoke. Soon more cadets joined the defense, forming a line behind them. The Scorn began to fall back, confused. This wasn't supposed to happen. A group of untrained cadets pushing them away. Zyra felt energy rush through her veins. She had never fought like this, and without a network, without shared minds, only trust, instinct, and the sound of Daniel's voice. At one point, a plasma grenade rolled toward them. Without hesitation, Daniel threw himself forward, kicking it away just before it exploded. The blast threw him hard into a wall. Zyra ran to him, heart pounding. Daniel! He coughed, blood on his lip but a grin still on his face. I'm fine. Keep going. You're insane, she said, pulling him up. Probably, he replied, picking up his pipe again. But it's working. They fought until the last of the Scorn ships began to retreat, engines roaring as they disappeared into the clouds. The battlefield fell silent except for the crackle of fire and the heavy breathing of survivors. Smoke covered the sky. The academy was in ruins, but still standing. Zyra looked around at the scattered cadets, then at Daniel. His uniform was torn, his hands bleeding, his face bruised. Yet he stood tall, his eyes steady. She felt a strange chill in her chest. Not fear, but realization. He had no link, no enhancements, no alien strength. And yet, when everything fell apart, it was him who held them together. Daniel, she said softly, how did you do that? He wiped the blood from his mouth, looking out at the burning horizon. We've been fighting impossible battles for as long as we've been alive, and he said, it's kind of our thing. Zyra stared at him for a long moment, and for the first time in her life, she understood what made humans different. Not their technology, not their power, but something deeper, a fire that refused to die even when surrounded by darkness. The battlefield was quiet now. Smoke rose from the shattered walls of the Kirith Academy. The air smelled of metal, ash, and burned circuits. The twin suns were hidden behind dark clouds, and the once glorious courtyard was filled with broken armor and flickering lights. Zyra stood among the ruins, her chest heaving. Her hands still shook from the fight. Around her, other cadets were helping the wounded and putting out the fires. And then she saw him, Daniel. He stood at the center of the chaos, his armor gone, his uniform torn to pieces. His face was smeared with dust and blood, but his eyes were steady. He looked like he had been carved out of the storm itself. Captain Tereth approached, his metallic armor cracked, voice hoarse. "Who organized the defense?" he demanded. One of the cadets pointed toward Daniel.
"The human, sir."
"He gave orders when the battle net failed." The captain blinked. "The human?" SThe watched as Daniel turned, exhaustion in every movement. When he met the captain's gaze, he didn't look proud, just tired. "I didn't plan anything," Daniel said quietly. "I just did what needed to be done." The captain studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You did well, cadet. You saved lives today." Daniel only gave a small nod and walked away. SThe followed him, her boots crunching on the scorched ground. He stopped near the edge of the ruined training field where the flames still burned low. The light from the fire reflected in his eyes. "Why do you do this?" she asked softly. "Why do you keep risking your life like that?" Daniel was silent for a while. Then he said, "Because someone has to." SThe frowned. "But you could have died. You're not like us. You don't have armor, you don't have speed." "I know," Daniel interrupted gently. "I don't have what you have. But maybe that's why I can't just stand back and watch. If I die helping, then at least it means I mattered." SThe looked at him speechless. His voice wasn't proud, wasn't heroic. It was simple, real. A soft wind blew across the courtyard, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke and melted steel. In that silence, SThe began to see something she had never noticed before. The light in his eyes. Not the kind of light that came from energy or power. This one was something different. It was the human spark, a quiet, stubborn fire that refused to die, no matter how dark the world became. When the medical teams arrived, they tried to take Daniel to the medbay, but he refused until every wounded cadet had been helped first. Even the aliens who had mocked him earlier looked at him differently now, not with laughter, but with respect. SThe helped him walk when he finally agreed to treatment. "You can't save everyone, Daniel," she said softly. He smiled weakly. "Maybe not, but I can try." His voice was fading and his steps were slow, but there was something unbreakable in him, something that made SThe's heart ache. That night, the academy gathered in the Great Hall for a report. The instructors spoke of heavy damage, of fallen cadets, of the cost of survival. But when Captain Tereth mentioned Daniel's name, the entire hall went silent. "He fought without armor," the captain said, "without the battle net, without enhancements, and yet he stood his ground when all others fell. Remember that." Every eye turned toward Daniel, sitting quietly in the corner, wrapped in bandages. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like someone who had simply done what needed to be done. SThe watched him, her heart full of emotions she couldn't name. Pride, respect, maybe something more. Later, when the hall emptied, she found him again outside under the night sky. The stars were faint, hidden by smoke. "You know," she said softly, "when I first saw you, I thought you were the weakest being I'd ever met." Daniel smiled faintly. "You weren't wrong. But now," she continued, her voice trembling slightly, "I think you might be the strongest." He didn't answer right away. He just looked up at the stars. "Strength isn't what you're born with," he said finally. "It's what you decide to keep even when everything's gone." SThe looked at him, this small, fragile human who had changed everything she believed about power. The alien girl who once laughed now felt something new. Awe, and deep inside her heart, she knew the truth. This wasn't just bravery. It was something much greater. It was what humans carried across the star, when a spark that refused to fade even in the darkest night. The human spark. Days passed after the attack. The Kirith Academy slowly began to rebuild. Broken towers were repaired, walls were raised again, and life returned. Quieter, more thoughtful than before. But something had changed in everyone. The cadets no longer looked at Daniel Reeves as the weak human from a forgotten planet. They looked at him as someone who had stood in the fire and refused to fall. SThe noticed it too. Wherever he walked, people made way. Some nodded in respect. Others simply watched him, wondering how a being with no enhancements could do what even trained warriors could not. Still, Daniel himself never acted different. He trained the same way, ate the same simple food, and smiled with that same calmness. But there was a distance in his eyes now, a quiet weight that Zaira couldn't ignore. One evening, she found him again on the academy's outer wall. The sky above was full of stars, clear and endless. The wind carried the faint sound of rebuilding work below. Zaira walked over and sat beside him. "You always come here," she said softly. Daniel smiled. "It's the only place where the stars look almost like home." She looked at him carefully. "You never talk much about Earth. Why?" He was quiet for a while. Then he sighed. "Because it's not the same anymore." Zaira tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Daniel stared into the distance, his voice low but steady. "You all think of Earth as a new member of the Union, a small blue world that finally reached the stars. But that's not true. The Earth you know is gone." Zaira blinked. "Gone?" He nodded slowly. "My people lived through things no one else could imagine. Wars that burned continents. Storms that drowned cities. We destroyed our own world before we ever looked beyond it. The oceans turned black. The air turned poison. Millions died. But somehow, we kept living." Zaira felt a cold ache in her chest. "You mean your world died," Daniel finished softly. "A long time ago. The Earth I was born on is not the same Earth written in the Union files. What's left is scattered colonies, survivors who carry the name, not the planet." Silence filled the air. Zaira didn't know what to say. Daniel continued, voice heavy but calm. "We came from ashes, from ruins. We learned to breathe through smoke and fight through fear. We became what we are because we had no other choice. That's why I don't give up, Zaira. Because I come from a world that refused to die." Zaira looked at him. Really looked. She saw the tiredness in his face, the pain behind his quiet smile. But beyond that, she saw something greater. The unbreakable will of a species that had lost everything and still stood. "Your people," she whispered. "You're not just survivors. You're reborn." Daniel smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe we just forgot how to stop." For a long time, they sat in silence watching the stars. The twin moons reflected in Zaira's violet eyes, and Daniel's gaze stayed fixed on the farthest point in the sky, where, perhaps, the ghosts of Earth still floated among the stars. Zaira finally spoke again, her voice soft but full of respect. "When I first met you, I laughed at you. I thought humans were weak, foolish, fragile." Daniel chuckled lightly. "You weren't wrong," she shook her head. "No, I was blind. I thought strength was power, control, perfection. But now I understand real strength is something else. It's what you carry when you have nothing left." He turned toward her, eyes warm. "That's something every human learns early. We fall, we break, but we always rebuild. Sometimes I think that's our real gift. Not intelligence, not courage, just the will to keep trying." Zaira looked down at her hands. "Maybe that's what the galaxy needs most." Daniel didn't answer. He just watched the horizon. The first light of dawn began to touch the clouds, painting them gold and red. Zaira turned to him one last time. "Daniel, I think you've reminded us of something important." He smiled. "And what's that?" She took a slow breath. "That even when a world ends, humanity doesn't." The words hung between them, glowing like the sunrise. In that moment, Zaira understood the truth that would spread across the stars, that the small, fragile creatures called humans were not weak. They were something far rarer. They were proof that even in a universe full of power, the greatest force of all was still the will to survive. The alien girl who once laughed at the human now bowed her head in quiet respect, and far above the ruined academy, as the dawn rose over a new world, the light reflected in Daniel's tired eyes, the same spark that had carried humanity through centuries of fire. The spark that would never die, the human spark.